The celestial space station orbiting Lumina Prime was a masterpiece of crystalline architecture that made Jake Mitchell feel like he was floating inside a diamond. Every surface refracted light in impossible ways, creating rainbow patterns that shifted and danced as the station rotated, while the air itself seemed to shimmer with an energy that made his skin tingle. "Bloody hell," he muttered under his breath, adjusting his grip on the equipment case that contained humanity's contribution to the first official cultural exchange with the Celestial Dominion. They certainly know how to make an impression. His colleague, Dr. Elena Vasquez, shot him a warning look. "Remember, Jake, we're representing all of humanity here. Try to keep the commentary professional." "Right, sorry," Jake replied, though he couldn't help grinning. 28 years as a communications specialist had taught him that every first contact situation was essentially an exercise in mutual confusion, and the Celestials were proving no exception. Their preliminary communications had been so formal they read like legal documents, full of phrases like honored exchange protocols and dignified cultural synthesis. The reception chamber they entered defied every architectural principle Jake understood. The walls curved impossibly, creating spaces that seemed larger inside than outside, while bioluminescent patterns flowed across surfaces like living constellations. At the center of it all stood a figure that made Jake's breath catch despite his professional composure. Princess Aelindar was exactly as tall as the briefing materials had indicated, nearly 6.5 feet, but no description could have prepared him for the reality of her presence. Her skin was luminescent silver that shifted between colors like aurora light, her hair fell like liquid starlight to her shoulders, and her eyes held depths that reminded him of looking into clear night sky. She wore robes that seemed to be cut from crystallized moonbeams, and when she moved, she appeared to glide rather than walk. "Welcome, honored representatives of the Human Federation," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in Jake's bones. "I am Princess Aelindar, heir to the Celestial Throne, designated coordinator for cultural exchange protocols." Even her greeting sounded like she was reading from a manual. Jake found himself wondering if anyone had ever taught her how to simply say hello. "Your Royal Highness," Dr. Vasquez replied with a formal bow, "we're honored by your welcome. I'm Dr. Elena Vasquez, head of Xenocultural Studies, and this is Jake Mitchell, our senior communications specialist." Jake stepped forward and offered what he hoped was an appropriately respectful nod. "Pleasure to meet you, Your Highness. Looking forward to working together." Princess Aelindar's star-like eyes studied him with an intensity that suggested she was cataloging every detail of his appearance and behavior. "The pleasure is reciprocal, Communications Specialist Mitchell. Shall we proceed to the technical briefing chamber?" The next 2 hours were a masterclass in formal politeness. Princess Aelindar guided them through the station's communication arrays, translation protocols, and data exchange systems with the precision of someone who had memorized every technical manual ever written. Her explanations were flawless, her questions insightful, and her manners so perfectly diplomatic that Jake found himself wondering if she was actually a very sophisticated artificial intelligence. It wasn't until they reached the quantum transmission array that things became interesting. Jake was explaining the compatibility requirements for human communication systems when he fumbled his data pad, sending it clattering across the crystalline floor. Princess Aelindar moved with fluid grace to retrieve it, her luminescent fingers barely touching the device as she handed it back to him. "Thanks, love," Jake said automatically, the casual endearment rolling off his tongue without thought. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Princess Aelindar froze completely, her luminous skin cycling through colors Jake had never seen before, deep purples and golds that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Her star-like eyes went wide, and for a moment she looked less like an ethereal princess and more like someone who had just heard her own name spoken in a language she thought was extinct. "Princess?" Dr. Vasquez asked with concern. "Are you all right?" Before Aelindar could respond, her telepathic attendants materialized around them with the fluid speed that Jake was learning characterized celestial movement under stress. They spoke rapidly in their own language, their voices carrying undertones of alarm that needed no translation. "The lost words," one of them said in heavily accented standard. She spoke to her with the lost words. He, another corrected. The human male used the ancient phrase. Jake looked between the agitated celestials and the still frozen princess, his confusion growing by the second. I'm sorry, what did I say wrong? I was just saying thank you. The attendants exchanged glances that spoke of complex telepathic communication happening too quickly for Jake to follow. Princess Aelindar finally seemed to come back to herself, though her skin continued to shift through subtle color variations that hadn't been there before. You said. Love, she said quietly, the word coming out as though she was testing its weight on her tongue. You called me love. Well, yes, Jake replied, still confused. It's just a casual expression where I'm from. Didn't mean anything formal by it. Nothing formal, Princess Aelindar repeated, and Jake could have sworn he heard wonder in her voice. You expressed affection, without ceremony. Without telepathic protocol. Without purpose. Dr. Vasquez was looking between them with the expression of someone watching a cultural minefield explode in slow motion. Perhaps we should continue this discussion in a more private setting? Princess Aelindar nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving Jake's face. Yes. Private setting. There are explanations that must be given. As they were escorted to a smaller chamber, Jake caught Dr. Vasquez's worried expression. What do you think I stepped in? He whispered. I don't know, she replied quietly, but I have a feeling it's bigger than either of us realized. Behind them, Princess Aelindar walked in silence, her luminescent skin still shifting through colors that hadn't existed in celestial space for nearly 1,000 years. The private chamber Princess Aelindar led them to was smaller than the grand reception areas, but no less impressive. Crystalline walls displayed slowly shifting patterns that Jake realized were actually historical records, showing scenes from celestial history in three-dimensional light sculptures that moved like living memories. Please, be seated, the princess said, gesturing to furniture that appeared to grow from the floor at her command. She herself remained standing, her luminescent skin now settled into a pale silver that reminded Jake of moonlight on water. Dr. Vasquez opened her mouth to speak, but Princess Aelindar raised a graceful hand. Before explanations are given, I must ask something of communications specialist Mitchell. When you used the word love, what did you intend to convey? Jake considered the question seriously, sensing that his answer mattered more than he understood. Nothing specific, really. It's just a way of showing friendliness, casual affection. Like saying mate or pal, but warmer. Where I grew up, people use it all the time, shopkeepers, bus drivers, anyone being helpful. It's just a way of acknowledging that you appreciate someone. Casual affection, Princess Aelindar repeated slowly. Warmth without purpose. Appreciation without formal obligation. That's about right, Jake confirmed. Why? Did I accidentally propose marriage or declare war or something? The princess's laugh was like wind chimes made of starlight, but there was something almost heartbroken about it. You declared nothing, communications specialist Mitchell. You simply spoke in a language that has been forbidden in celestial space for 843 years. Dr. Vasquez leaned forward with obvious scholarly interest. Forbidden? Why would expressions of affection be forbidden? Princess Aelindar moved to one of the crystalline walls and touched it with her fingertips. The historical displays shifted, showing scenes of celestial society from centuries past, beings like her laughing together, embracing casually, their skin shifting through warm colors as they interacted with obvious joy and spontaneity. This was our people before the Great Purification, she explained. We were emotional. Chaotic. Our telepathic abilities were strong, but uncontrolled. We felt everything our neighbors felt, shared every joy and sorrow without filter or protection. Love, in all its forms, was spoken freely and felt by all. The scenes shifted, showing what appeared to be a period of social upheaval, celestials clutching their heads in pain, cities in disorder, the beautiful aurora-like skin colors becoming harsh and discordant. What happened? Jake asked quietly. Our population reached critical mass, Princess Aelendar replied. Too many minds, too much emotion, too much unfiltered connection. The telepathic feedback loops became overwhelming. Beings went mad from feeling the love and loss of billions simultaneously. Society began to collapse under the weight of shared emotion. So you removed it? Dr. Vasquez asked, her academic mind clearly struggling with the implications. The High Council decreed the Great Purification, the princess confirmed. All words of casual affection were removed from our language. Emotional expression was formalized, regulated, controlled. Telepathic protocols were established to prevent chaotic emotional contamination. We chose order over chaos, stability over spontaneity. Jake watched the historical displays showing the transformation of celestial society, the gradual removal of warm colors from their skin patterns, the increasing formality of their interactions, the careful distance they maintained from one another even while communicating telepathically. But the cost, he said, understanding beginning to dawn. You lost the ability to just care about each other casually. Princess Aelendar's skin flickered with the faintest hint of gold. We maintained care. Formal care. Dutiful care. Appropriate care within established protocols. That's not the same thing, is it? Jake asked gently. The silence that followed was profound. Princess Aelendar stood perfectly still, her luminescent form reflected infinitely in the crystalline walls, but Jake could see something shifting in her star-like eyes, a vulnerability that formal protocols weren't designed to handle. No, she said finally, so quietly that Jake had to strain to hear her. It is not the same thing. Dr. Vasquez was taking notes with the intensity of someone documenting a major anthropological discovery. Princess, forgive my directness, but what you're describing sounds like emotional suppression on a civilizational scale. Have there been any attempts to reverse or modify these protocols? Such attempts would be considered contamination events, Princess Aelendar replied, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with the answer. The stability of our society depends on maintaining proper emotional distance. Casual affection leads to telepathic chaos. Does it, though? Jake found himself asking. I mean, has anyone actually tested that theory recently? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been stable at the cost of being, well, happy. Princess Aelendar turned to face him directly, and Jake was struck by how alone she looked despite being surrounded by the achievements of her civilization. Happiness is not a requirement for effective governance, communications specialist Mitchell. Maybe not, Jake agreed. But it's a pretty good requirement for a worthwhile life. The princess stared at him for a long moment, her skin cycling through the faintest hints of colors that Jake suspected she wasn't supposed to be displaying. When you said, thanks, love, what did it feel like? To speak those words. Jake considered the question seriously. Natural, I suppose. Like acknowledging that you'd done something kind and I appreciated it. It felt warm. Warm, she repeated, as though testing the concept. Without telepathic connection. Without formal protocol. You felt warmth simply from expressing appreciation. Yeah, Jake said simply. That's kind of what casual affection is about. Princess Aelendar was quiet for a long time, staring at the historical displays showing her people's lost capacity for spontaneous emotional expression. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of something that might have been longing. I would like to understand this warmth, she said carefully. These, casual expressions of care. Would you be willing to explain them further? Jake exchanged a glance with Dr. Vasquez, who nodded encouragingly. I'd be happy to, love, he said, deliberately using the endearment again. This time, Princess Aelendar didn't freeze. Instead, her skin shifted to the faintest shade of gold, and she smiled, not the formal diplomatic expression Jake had seen before, but something genuine and wondering. Thank you, she said softly. Thank you. Jake. Over the following days, Jake found himself in the unprecedented position of serving as an informal teacher of human emotional expression to the heir of the celestial throne. Their daily technical briefings had evolved into something far more complex, part cultural exchange, part anthropological study, part careful excavation of feelings that had been buried for centuries. So when humans say, "No worries," Princess Aelendar asked during their morning session, this conveys both dismissal of concern and reassurance of continued positive regard. Pretty much, Jake confirmed, watching her process the concept with the intensity she brought to everything. It's a way of saying, don't feel bad about whatever happened, because I still think you're alright. Her skin shifted to a soft bronze color that Jake was learning indicated deep concentration. The efficiency is remarkable. A single phrase that prevents guilt, maintains relationship stability, and expresses ongoing affection. When you put it like that, it sounds like we're running some kind of emotional optimization program, Jake said with a laugh. But yeah, I suppose that's what casual affection does, it keeps the social machinery running smoothly. Princess Aelendar tilted her head, a gesture that was becoming familiar. In celestial society, such optimization requires formal protocols and telepathic coordination. You achieve it through simplicity. Sometimes the simple way is the best way, Jake replied, then caught himself using another casual endearment. You're getting the hang of this brilliantly, by the way. The compliment caused another color shift, this time to a warm gold that reminded Jake of sunrise. He'd been keeping careful mental notes of her skin patterns, fascinated by how they seemed to reflect emotions she wasn't supposed to be experiencing. Jake, she said carefully, testing his name on her tongue. May I ask you something of a personal nature? Course, love. Ask away. When you express casual affection to me, do you feel connected? Not telepathically, but in some other way. Jake considered this seriously. It was a good question, and one he hadn't really examined before. Yeah, I suppose I do. Not connected like we're sharing thoughts or anything, but, like there's less distance between us. Like you matter to me as a person, not just as a diplomatic contact. Princess Aelendar was quiet for a long moment, her luminescent form reflected in the crystalline surfaces around them. I have never experienced matching to someone without formal obligation, she said finally. The admission hit Jake harder than he'd expected. Never. Not even as a child. Celestial children are raised communally, with telepathic bonding protocols established from birth, she explained. All care is structured, purposeful, designed to prevent emotional chaos. Personal attachment outside formal relationships is discouraged. Bloody hell, Jake muttered, then caught himself. Sorry, that just sounds incredibly lonely. Loneliness is an inefficient emotional state, Princess Aelendar replied, though her tone suggested she was quoting rather than believing. Celestial society eliminates such inefficiencies. Does it, though? Jake asked. Because from what I've seen, you lot are efficient at a lot of things, but you don't seem particularly happy. Happiness is not the objective of civilized society. Why not? The question came out more forcefully than Jake had intended. I mean, seriously, if the point of having a civilization isn't to make people happy, what's the point? Princess Aelendar stared at him with an expression that suggested he'd asked something unprecedented. Stability. Order. The prevention of chaos. Right, but why? What's the end goal of all that stability and order? To maintain the civilization. Which exists to provide stability and order, she finished, and Jake could see the circular logic dawning on her. I see your point. Don't get me wrong, Jake said quickly. Stability and order are good things. But they're supposed to be tools, not goals. Tools for creating something better. And you believe happiness is better? I believe caring about each other is better, Jake replied. Happiness is just what tends to happen when people feel genuinely cared for. Princess Aelendar moved to the chamber's large viewport, staring out at the crystal city that sprawled across Lumina Prime's surface. The High Council would consider such philosophy dangerous contamination. Maybe, Jake agreed. But they might also be wrong. They have maintained order for nearly a millennium. And in all that time, have any of them ever called you love just because they were glad you existed? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Princess Aelindar's skin cycled through several colors before settling on a deep blue that Jake hadn't seen before. No, she said quietly. They have not. Well then, Jake said gently, maybe their definition of success needs some work. That evening, as Jake was preparing to return to his quarters aboard the human vessel, Princess Aelindar stopped him at the transport bay. Jake, she said, and he noticed she was deliberately using his name instead of his formal title. I have been practicing the human expressions you taught me. Oh. How's it going? I attempted to use casual affection with one of my attendants, she said. I called her Dear One when she brought me my evening meal. And she immediately requested telepathic confirmation that I had not been subjected to emotional contamination, Princess Aelindar replied, her skin shifting to what Jake was beginning to recognize as her version of rueful humor. The incident has been reported to the High Council. Jake felt his stomach drop. Christ, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to get you in trouble. You did not get me in trouble, she corrected. I chose to attempt the expression. The consequences are mine to bear. Still, if there's anything I can do. There is, she interrupted. Tonight, when you return to your ship, your colleagues will ask how the cultural exchange progressed. You will tell them about technical specifications and communication protocols. But when they ask if you learned anything unexpected. Yeah. Princess Aelindar's skin shifted to the warm gold he was learning to associate with her genuine emotions. Tell them you learned that some languages of the heart are too important to stay buried forever. Right, Jake said, oddly moved by her words. Good night then, love. Good night. She paused, testing the words carefully, dear friend. As Jake's transport carried him back to the human ship, he found himself smiling. It wasn't much. Just 2 words spoken with careful warmth, but it felt like watching someone take their first breath of fresh air after a lifetime in a sealed room. The summons came at dawn, delivered by a celestial courier whose formal bearing suggested this was no routine meeting. Jake found himself escorted not to the familiar technical briefing chambers, but to the High Council's deliberation sphere, a vast crystalline space that seemed to exist partially outside normal reality, where 7 of the most powerful telepathic beings in known space sat in judgment. Princess Aelindar stood in the center of the sphere, her luminescent form somehow diminished by the overwhelming presence of the council members. Their skin patterns were locked in formal silver, showing no trace of the warm colors Jake had learned to associate with genuine emotion. Communications Specialist Mitchell, the Prime Counselor intoned, her voice carrying harmonics that made Jake's teeth ache, you have been brought before this assembly to account for the contamination you have introduced to our air. Jake felt Dr. Vasquez's steadying presence beside him, but knew this was something he'd have to face alone. Your Honor, I'm not sure I understand the charge. You have taught Princess Aelindar to use expressions of casual affection, another counselor declared. You have corrupted her telepathic discipline with emotional chaos. You have violated the sacred protocols that maintain our civilization's stability. I taught her to say, thank you, in a friendly way, Jake replied, keeping his voice level despite the intimidating circumstances. I hardly think that constitutes corruption. Observe the evidence, the Prime Counselor commanded. The space around them filled with holographic recordings of Jake's conversations with Princess Aelindar, his casual endearments, her increasingly warm responses, the gradual shift in her skin patterns from formal silver to the forbidden golds and bronzes of unregulated emotion. You see how the contamination spreads, a third counselor noted. Each exposure to your casual affection degraded her telepathic discipline further. She began attempting to use these expressions with her attendants, disrupting the emotional order of our entire diplomatic station. Jake watched the recordings with growing understanding. Every moment of connection, every small breakthrough in Princess Aelindar's emotional development, was being presented as evidence of dangerous contamination. "She's not contaminated," he said firmly. "She's learning to care about people without needing formal permission to do it." "Precisely the problem," the Prime Counselor replied. "Unregulated emotional expression leads to telepathic chaos. This has been proven repeatedly throughout our history." "Has it?" Jake challenged. "Or have you just been afraid to test whether your assumptions are still valid?" The silence that followed was so complete that Jake could hear his own heartbeat. The counselors exchanged glances that spoke of complex telepathic communication, while Princess Aelindar remained perfectly still, her skin locked in formal silver. "You question 8 centuries of proven policy," the Prime Counselor demanded. "I question whether fear-based policies serve the people they're supposed to protect," Jake replied. "You've created a civilization where no one can say, 'I care about you,' without triggering a contamination alert. That's not stability, that's emotional imprisonment." "Emotional regulation prevents chaos," another counselor insisted. "The historical records are clear." "The historical records show that uncontrolled telepathic feedback caused problems," Jake corrected. "But that doesn't mean all emotional expression has to be banned. You've thrown out the baby with the bathwater." Dr. Vasquez stepped forward, her academic training clearly kicking in. "Your Honors, if I may contribute to this discussion from a xenocultural perspective. Many telepathic species have found ways to maintain emotional expression while regulating telepathic interference. The solution isn't emotional suppression, but better telepathic discipline." "Irrelevant," the Prime Counselor declared. "The matter before us is not policy review, but contamination response. Princess Aelindar must undergo immediate purification protocols to restore her telepathic discipline." "No," Jake said firmly. The words seemed to echo through the crystalline space like a thunderclap. The counselors stared at him with expressions that suggested no one had ever simply refused a High Council directive. "You object to our authority?" the Prime Counselor asked, her voice carrying dangerous harmonics. "I object to erasing the best thing that's happened to your princess in her entire life," Jake replied. "She's not contaminated, she's finally learning what it feels like to be genuinely cared for. And if you take that away from her, you'll be committing a crime against everything that makes life worth living." "Emotional attachment is weakness," another counselor stated. "Is it?" Jake turned to address the entire assembly. "Because from what I've seen, Princess Aelindar has become more effective, more insightful, and more capable since she started experiencing casual affection. She's not weaker, she's stronger." "The data supports this observation," Princess Aelindar said quietly, speaking for the first time since the proceedings began. "My telepathic range has increased. My emotional regulation has improved. My diplomatic effectiveness has shown measurable enhancement. Irrelevant if it comes at the cost of civilizational stability," the Prime Counselor replied. Jake felt something click into place, a moment of absolute clarity about what needed to be said. "Your Honors, may I demonstrate something?" Before anyone could object, he turned to Princess Aelindar and said simply, "I care about you, love. Not because of duty or protocol or diplomatic necessity, but because you're worth caring about. You matter to me." The effect was immediate and profound. Princess Aelindar's skin exploded into warm gold, and something happened that Jake felt rather than saw, a telepathic projection that filled the entire chamber with the sensation of being genuinely cherished. It was warmth without demand, care without condition, the simple joy of mattering to someone else. Every counselor in the chamber froze as the projection washed over them, their formal silver skin patterns flickering with colors that hadn't been seen in celestial space for centuries. For just a moment, Jake caught a glimpse of what they must have been like before the Great Purification, beings capable of tremendous joy and connection. "That," Jake said into the stunned silence, "is what you've been calling contamination. That feeling of being cared for, of mattering to someone else. That's what you've been so afraid of." The Prime Counselor's skin was cycling through colors as she struggled to process what she'd experienced. The telepathic harmonics, they were not chaotic. They were enhancing. Casual affection doesn't weaken telepathic ability, Princess Aelendar said, her voice stronger than Jake had ever heard it. It enriches it. It provides emotional foundation that makes stronger connection possible. The debate that followed lasted hours, but Jake could see the tide turning. The counselors had experienced something they'd forgotten was possible, the simple joy of being cared for without condition, and they were struggling to reconcile it with 8 centuries of fear-based policy. The Council will consider a graduated reintroduction of regulated emotional expression, the Prime Counselor announced finally. Princess Aelendar and Communications Specialist Mitchell will serve as cultural liaisons to develop appropriate protocols. As the assembly dispersed, Jake found himself walking beside Princess Aelendar through the crystal gardens that surrounded the deliberation sphere. Her skin was still glowing with soft gold, and her movements had lost the rigid formality he'd first encountered. "Jake," she said as they paused beside a fountain that sang with crystalline music, "I want to try something." "What's that, love?" She turned to face him, her star-like eyes bright with something that looked like joy. "Thanks, love," she said, the words coming out naturally, warmly, without any trace of the hesitation that had marked her earlier attempts. Jake grinned. "You're very welcome, love." As they continued walking through gardens that seemed brighter somehow, Princess Aelendar practiced the simple phrase that had started everything, each repetition becoming more natural and joyful. Overhead, the first celestial children in 8 centuries laughed as they played, their skin patterns cycling through colors that painted the crystal city in hues of hope and rediscovered warmth. Some languages, Jake reflected, were too important to stay lost forever.